There's a feeling you get, a certain kind of quiet, when the sun begins to dip behind the old western ridge. The long shadows of the oak trees my grandfather planted stretch across the meadow like gentle, protective arms. The light turns to honey, thick and slow, painting the white clapboard of the house in a warmth that feels like a memory. This land, it isn't just dirt and trees to me, it's the soil of my soul. Every blade of grass, every weathered fence post. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Every creak of the porch, swing under my weight, it's all part of the story of me. Of us. I'm Ruth. I'm 53 years old, and if you'd told me a few years ago that I'd be sitting on this same porch, fighting for the very right to be here, I'd have laughed a sad, disbelieving kind of laugh. I thought this was my forever. I thought the battles of my life were behind me. I bought this land with my husband Ben. Bought is too simple a word. We poured our youth into it. We were barely in our 20s, dizzy with love and a foolish, beautiful courage that only the young can possess. We didn't see 10 acres of overgrown field and a dilapidated farmhouse. We saw a future. I can still feel the phantom ache in my muscles from those early days. The blisters that would burst and reform as we cleared brush, patched the roof, planted the first vegetable garden. Ben's hands, always so strong and capable, would be caked with dirt, and he'd wipe a sweaty strand of hair from my forehead, leaving a smudge of earth. "We're building a legacy, Ruthie," he'd say, his voice full of that unwavering certainty. "Something that will last." We never had children. That was a sorrow we learned to carry together, a quiet, private ache that settled deep in the bones of this house. But in a way, this land became our child. We nurtured it, worried over it, celebrated its small victories. The first year the apple trees bore fruit, the winter, the old fireplace finally heated the whole downstairs, without smoking us out. We learned its moods, where the wild strawberries grew thickest, which corner the deer favored at dawn. When the cancer took Ben, 10 years ago now, I thought the heart had been ripped clean out of this place. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket. For months, I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, the memories a sharp, constant pain. I'd hear the echo of his laugh in the empty barn, see the shadow of him walking toward me from the woodline. I almost sold it. I came so close. Auntie Clara, who has never been one for sentimentality, even told me it might be for the best. "A house this big for one person, Ruth? It's an anchor," she'd said, her voice characteristically blunt over a cup of too strong tea. But Auntie Grace, she was the one who saved me. She came and stayed for a week, not saying much, just being. She'd sit with me on the porch in the evenings, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the crickets. One night, as the fireflies began their dizzying dance over the meadow, she said, "Ben isn't in the past, honey. He's in the gnarled roots of that oak you two planted. He's in the strength of these timbers you raised together. He's in the peace you feel right here, in this very spot. Don't you let grief make you abandon a love like that." She was right. This land wasn't just a place Ben and I had lived. It was the living, breathing monument to our love. Letting it go would have been a second death for him. So, I stayed. I learned to be alone without being lonely. I learned the different songs the wind sang through the pines in January versus July. The grief softened, losing its sharp, jagged edges, and settled into a gentle, enduring presence. I found a new rhythm, a life that was quiet but full. I had my garden, my books, my friendships with the aunties, and a few good neighbors. It was enough. It was more than enough. And then, my brother Mark came to visit. It had been years. Mark was 8 years my junior, and we'd never been particularly close. He was the baby, the one who'd chafed against our small-town upbringing and fled for the city the first chance he got. He'd built a life I knew very little about, something in commercial real estate, a world of deals and contracts and a pace of life that made my head spin. He'd come for our parents' funerals, of course, a somber, suited figure who seemed uncomfortable and out of place. He'd never understood my attachment to this patch of dirt, as he'd once called it. So, when his expensive, overly polished car came crunching up my gravel driveway that spring afternoon, a feeling of unease coiled in my stomach, right alongside a flicker of familial obligation. He got out, looking every bit the successful urbanite in his crisp chinos and polo shirt, a stark contrast to my faded jeans and worn work boots. "Ruth," he said, his voice too loud for the quiet yard. He enveloped me in a hug that felt more like an assessment than an embrace. "Look at this place, still standing." He said it like he was surprised. "Mark," I said, pulling back. "This is a surprise. Is everything all right? Can't a brother just visit his big sister?" he said, smiling a wide, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was in the area, thought I'd see how you're getting on." I invited him in, made a pot of coffee. He paced the living room, not sitting, his eyes cataloging everything: the worn Persian rug, the shelves of books, the simple, solid furniture. "You've kept it up," he remarked, though his tone suggested he found it quaint. We made stilted small talk for 20 minutes. He asked about the aunties, about the town. I asked about his work, his son, Leo, who I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. His answers were vague. Finally, he settled into Ben's old armchair, the one I still couldn't bring myself to reupholster, and leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Look, Ruth, I'll get to the point. I'm worried about you." The coil in my stomach tightened. "Worried? I'm fine, Mark. I'm perfectly fine. Are you?" He spread his hands, gesturing around the room. "You're out here all alone. This is a lot of land for a woman your age to manage. What if something happens? What if you get sick? This house, it's old. It needs constant work. The roof, the plumbing, it's a money pit." "I manage just fine," I said, my voice cooler than I intended. "I have good neighbors. I'm not helpless." "I didn't say you were helpless," he said, his tone placating. "I'm saying you shouldn't have to struggle. You've been through enough. Listen, I have a proposition for you, a great opportunity." He went on to describe a friend who was a developer, looking for just this kind of land, picturesque, with good road frontage. He threw out a number, a sum of money that was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. "You could buy a lovely little condo in town, Ruth. No more shoveling snow, no more worrying about a well pump failing. You'd be set for life. Comfortable. Safe." The words hung in the air between us, ugly and foreign. A condo. Selling my legacy, Ben's legacy, for a comfortable little box in town. I felt a hot flush rise up my neck. "Mark," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "This is my home. It's not for sale." His smile tightened. "Don't be sentimental, Ruth. This is business. This is about your future." "My future is here," I said, standing up, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "This land was left to me. Mom and Dad knew what it meant to me. It's mine." A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something hard and impatient that he quickly masked. "Of course, it's yours," he said, standing as well. "I'm just trying to look out for my big sister. Just think about it, okay? Promise me you'll think about it." I didn't promise him anything. I walked him to the door, the silence between us thick and heavy. As he drove away, the dust from his tires hanging in the still air, I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the warm spring Sunday. I looked out at the meadow, at the ancient, steadfast oak trees. The peace I had fought so hard to find felt fragile, threatened. It was just a conversation, I told myself. Just Mark being Mark, seeing dollar signs where I saw home. But deep down, in a place beyond reason, I knew. This wasn't over. The first crack in my world had appeared, and I had a terrible feeling it was only going to get wider. The memory of Mark's visit lingered for days like a bad smell I couldn't air out of the house. I tried to shake it off, to bury myself in the comforting, predictable work of the land. It was planting season, and the earth was warm and willing. I spent hours on my hands and knees in the garden, the rich, dark soil staining my knees, the sun a welcome weight on my back. The physical labor was a balm. Each seed tucked into the ground felt like a tiny act of defiance, a reaffirmation of my life here. Auntie Grace came by with a basket of her famous lemon blueberry scones, her radar for trouble always impeccably tuned. We sat at my old pine kitchen table, the one scarred with decades of family meals. "You've got a cloud hanging over you, Ruth," she said, "not one for subtle openings. Was it that brother of yours? I saw a fancy car that didn't belong around here turning out of your driveway last week." I let out a long, weary sigh. There was no hiding anything from Grace. She saw the world in shades of emotion, and she could read my face like a favorite book. I told her about Mark's visit, his proposition, the staggering sum of money, the condo. Her kindly face, usually wreathed in smiles, grew stern. "He what? That little weasel. He's always had his eye on anything of value, that one. Even as a boy, he'd rather count his birthday money than play with the toy it bought." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You told him no, of course." "Of course, I did. But he didn't like it, Grace. He had this look in his eye, like I was an unreasonable child refusing a piece of candy. Well, you stand your ground, honey. This is your home, Ben's home. It's not a piece of merchandise for your brother to flip for a profit." She clucked her tongue, a sound of pure disapproval. "You want me to have a word with Clara? You know she'd scare the bejesus out of him." I had to laugh at that. The thought of no-nonsense Auntie Clara, with her steely gaze and a tongue that could flay paint off a barn, confronting my slick city brother was a satisfying image. No, let's not start a war. I'm sure he'll drop it. He probably just saw an opportunity and got a little carried away. I was trying to convince myself as much as her. But a part of me knew Grace was right. Mark's ambition had a cold, single-minded quality to it that I'd seen glimpses of over the years. A week later, another car came up the driveway. This one was less ostentatious than Mark's, a sensible sedan, but it was just as unfamiliar. My heart gave a little nervous thump. Had Mark sent his developer friend? I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out onto the porch. The man who got out of the car was young, probably in his late 20s. He had Mark's smile, but on him, it seemed softer, more genuine. "Aunt Ruth?" He called out, his voice warm. "It's me, Leo. Leo, my nephew." I hadn't seen him since he was a gawky 15-year-old, all elbows and acne. The boy had vanished, replaced by this handsome, well-built young man with kind eyes. The tension in my shoulders eased immediately. "Leo? My goodness, look at you." I came down the porch steps, and he met me with a warm, easy hug. It felt nothing like his father's. "I know, it's been way too long," he said, pulling back but keeping his hands on my shoulders, looking at me with an open, friendly expression. "Dad mentioned he was out here visiting, and it just shamed me into action. I've been meaning to come see you for years. Life, you know? It just gets away from you." He had a charming, self-deprecating manner that was instantly disarming. I ushered him inside, suddenly self-conscious about the simple, slightly shabby state of the house, but Leo didn't seem to notice. He complimented everything: the view from the kitchen window, the smell of the bread I had baking, the character of the old wood floors. "Dad said you were holding down the fort out here all by yourself," he said, accepting a glass of iced tea. "I have to say, I'm impressed. This is a lot of work for one person." There it was again, the same refrain, but from him, it sounded like concern, not criticism. "Oh, I get by," I said lightly. "It keeps me out of trouble." He laughed, a good-natured sound. "Well, listen, that's part of why I'm here. I'm between jobs at the moment. I was in construction management, and I've got some time on my hands. Dad said you've got a list of things that need doing around here that's a mile long. I thought I could stick around for a few weeks, lend a hand. You know, pay back a little for all the Christmas presents you sent over the years. I was utterly disarmed. The offer was so generous, so unexpected. Oh, Leo, that's so kind of you, but I couldn't possibly ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering, he said, his smile earnest. Seriously. It would be good for me. Get me out of the city, some fresh air, some honest work. Let me help you, Aunt Ruth. Please. He looked so much like his mother in that moment, with that pleading, hopeful look in his eyes. And the truth was, there was a long list. The barn door had been sagging for a year, the gutters needed cleaning, and the thought of tackling the overgrown brush at the back of the property alone was daunting. Having a strong, young person around, it sounded like a blessing. Well, I said, hesitating, if you're sure, I wouldn't want to put you out. It's settled then, he said, clapping his hands together. I'll go grab my bag. And just like that, Leo moved into the spare room. The first few days were wonderful. He was a hard worker. I'll give him that. He fixed the barn door in an afternoon, something Ben and I had always meant to get around to. He cleared the brush with a relentless energy that both impressed and slightly worried me. He was strong, capable, and he seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch and he'd tell me about his life, his dreams of starting his own contracting business one day. He asked me about Ben, about my parents, about what it was like growing up here. He seemed interested. He made me feel less alone. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first, the tone began to shift. It started with small comments. You know, Aunt Ruth, these old windows are incredibly inefficient. You must be spending a fortune on heating oil. Or, this foundation has some concerning cracks. Have you ever had it looked at by a structural engineer? Or, while we were eating the dinner I'd cooked, you know, a place like this, with this much land, it's a huge liability. What if someone were to get hurt on the property? You could be sued for everything. The comments were always couched in concern, always from a place of just looking out for you. But they began to weave a tapestry of anxiety in my mind. The home I loved was being reframed, piece by piece, as a problem, a burden, a ticking time bomb of expense and danger. One evening, about 2 weeks into his stay, he came in from town, holding a sheaf of papers. I was at the print shop, and I got to talking with a guy who's a real estate lawyer, he said casually, spreading the papers on the table. He drew this up for me, just as a hypothetical. It's a co-ownership agreement. I froze, a dishcloth in my hand. A what? Nothing official, he said quickly, his hands up in a placating gesture. Just think of it as a safety net. If my name was on the deed with yours, I could help shoulder the liability. I could take out loans against the equity to make the necessary repairs, a new roof, those windows, maybe even some additions to increase the value. It would protect you, Ruth, and it would give me a stake in something real, something to build on for my future business. I stared at the papers, the legalese swimming before my eyes. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This felt wrong. It felt so wrong. Leo, this is very sudden, I managed to say, my voice thin. This land, it's all I have. It was Ben's. I know, and I respect that more than you know, he said, his voice dripping with sincerity. This isn't about taking it from you. It's about securing it, for both of us. Think of it as keeping it in the family. For good. For good. The words echoed in the quiet kitchen. He was offering me a solution to problems I'd never truly worried about until he'd arrived and pointed them out. He was offering me family, connection, security. But the cold knot in my stomach told me it was something else entirely. This wasn't the generous nephew I'd welcomed into my home. This was the same proposition his father had made, just wrapped in a kinder, more insidious package. I looked at his earnest, smiling face, and for the first time, I saw a shadow of his father lurking behind his eyes. The helpful nephew had just shown his hand, and the game had suddenly become very, very real. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The human heart is a foolish thing. Even when your mind knows the truth, when your gut has been screaming it at you. For days, the heart clings to the fraying rope of hope. It whispers, maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe he'll come to his senses. After Leo presented me with those co-ownership papers, a cold war of silence had settled over the house. We moved around each other like ghosts, the easy camaraderie of the first week replaced by a thick, unspoken tension. I kept waiting for him to apologize, to laugh it off as a bad joke, to be the nephew I thought I'd welcomed back into my life. That hope died on a Tuesday morning. It was a perfect, crisp autumn day, the kind where the sky is a sharp, brilliant blue and the leaves on the maples are blazing torches of red and gold. I was trying to lose myself in the simple, satisfying work of chopping wood for the winter. The solid thwack of the splitting maul a release for the anxiety coiled in my chest. I heard the distinct sound of a car engine, not Leo's sedan, but the familiar putter of old Mr. Henderson's mail truck coming up the lane. He usually just left the mail in the box at the end of the drive, but today, the truck came all the way to the house. Mr. Henderson got out, his kind, weathered face looking unusually solemn. He held a large, stiff manila envelope, not the usual bunch of bills and flyers. "Mornin', Ruth," he said, his voice gentle. "Got something here for you. Requires a signature." My heart, already working hard from the physical labor, gave a painful lurch. I leaned the maul against the woodpile and wiped my sweaty hands on my jeans. "What is it, Carl?" "Can't say for sure," he said, avoiding my eyes and holding out a digital clipboard. "But it's from a law office over in Clayton. The Barlow and Finch firm." The name meant nothing to me, but the words law office landed like a physical blow. The air went out of me. The beautiful, clear day suddenly felt menacing. With a hand that trembled slightly, I signed the screen. Carl handed me the envelope. It was heavy, ominous. "Anything I can do, Ruth?" he asked softly, his gaze full of a neighborly concern that nearly undid me. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. He nodded, touched the brim of his cap, and got back in his truck, leaving me standing alone in my yard, holding the thing I had dreaded but somehow never truly believed would come. I didn't open it right away. I carried it into the house like it was a live bomb, setting it on the kitchen table. I made a cup of tea I didn't want, my movements slow and deliberate. I watched the envelope as if it might move. Leo was out somewhere, probably in the barn, and a perverse part of me was glad. I didn't want him to see me receive this. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Finally, I couldn't stall any longer. I took a sharp knife and slit the envelope open. The document inside was thick, covered in dense, intimidating text. My eye scanned the page, not comprehending the legalese at first. Then, phrases started jumping out at me, each one a fresh stab. Petitioner, Mark Allen Thompson, brother of the respondent. Regarding the property located at 1,873 Sycamore Ridge Road, asserts a vested equitable interest in the said property, based on a long-standing family, understanding and inheritance agreement. Claims the respondent, Ruth Ann Thompson, holds title in constructive trust for the benefit of the petitioner and his heir, Leo James Thompson. Requests the court to partition the property, or order its sale and an equitable division of proceeds. I had to read it 3 times before the meaning fully sank in. He was suing me. My own brother was taking me to court. He wasn't just trying to persuade me or bully me. He was using the full force of the law to try and steal my home from me. The words constructive trust and partition were cold, clinical terms for a violent act, This was eviction by lawsuit. This was him trying to get a judge to do what he couldn't get me to do willingly. A white-hot fury rose in me, so intense it made my vision blur. But underneath the fury was a deep, yawning chasm of grief. This was a betrayal so complete, so cold-blooded, it felt like a death. The brother I'd grown up with, the little boy I'd helped teach to ride a bike, was gone. In his place was this petitioner. The back door opened, and Leo walked in, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Think I got the tractor's hydraulics sorted out," he started, but then he saw my face. He saw the open envelope on the table. His expression didn't change to shock or confusion. It shifted, subtly, into a mask of cool assessment. He knew. He had known it was coming. "Leo," I said, my voice a ragged whisper. I held up the document. "What is this?" He didn't even flinch. He tossed the rag onto the counter. "It looks like Dad is seeking a legal clarification regarding the ownership of the property." "Clarification?" I choked out, the fury breaking through. "He's suing me. He's claiming he has a right to my land. What family understanding?" There was no understanding. "Mom and Dad left this to me. You know that." "Do I?" he said, his voice calm, infuriatingly reasonable. "I know what you've told me, Ruth, but families have complicated histories. Dad has a different memory of the arrangements. The court is the best place to sort it out fairly." "Fairly?" I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "How is this fair? You came here. You lied to me. You pretended to care. You pretended to want to help. Was this the plan all along? Get your foot in the door, snoop around, and then help your father file papers to take it away from me." His mask of civility finally slipped. A flash of impatience, of contempt, crossed his face. "Nobody's trying to take anything from you, Ruth. We're trying to secure what's rightfully part of the family's assets. You're being selfish. You're sitting on all this land, all this potential, by yourself, letting it fall apart around you, while Dad and I are out in the world actually building something. We have a vision for this place." "Your vision?" I shot back, slamming my hand on the table, making the teacup rattle. "Not mine. This is my home. Ben's and my home. You have no right." "Ben's dead, Ruth," he snapped, the words cruel and deliberate. "He's been dead for 10 years. It's time to stop living in a shrine and start thinking like a rational adult." The air left my lungs. It was the most vicious thing anyone had ever said to me. It was designed to wound, and it did. It found the most tender, vulnerable part of my soul and drove a knife into it. I looked at him, at this stranger standing in my kitchen, and I knew then that there was no nephew here to reason with. There was only an adversary. "Get out," I said, my voice low and shaking. "I live here," he replied flatly. "Get out of my kitchen." I clarified, my gaze locked on his. "Get out of my sight. Now." He held my stare for a long, challenging moment, then shrugged, as if my anger was a trivial thing, and walked out of the room. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, going up to his room. I stood there, trembling, the legal document crumpled in my fist. I felt utterly alone. The walls of the house I loved seemed to be closing in on me. I needed to get out. I needed to not be under the same roof as him. I didn't even grab a coat. I just walked out the front door, got into my old pickup truck, and started driving. I didn't have a destination in mind. My hands were clenched so tight on the steering wheel my knuckles were white. The tears came then, hot and blinding, and I had to pull over on the shoulder of the country road, letting the sobs rack my body. It was a storm of rage, of betrayal, of a profound, crushing sadness. When the storm passed, leaving me hollowed out and numb, I knew where I needed to go. I started the truck again and drove the familiar route to Auntie Grace's little cottage on the edge of town. Her house was a haven, always smelling of baked goods and lavender. She must have seen my truck pull up, because she was at the door before I could even knock. Her face instantly full of worry. "Ruth? Honey, what's happened?" I couldn't speak. I just thrust the crumpled legal papers at her. She took them, her hands gentle, and led me inside to her cozy sitting room. She didn't read them immediately. She sat me down on the chintz sofa, wrapped a knitted afghan around my shoulders, and went to put the kettle on. She moved with a quiet, purposeful calm that was the antithesis of the chaos raging inside me. While the kettle heated, she sat beside me and started to read. I watched her face, saw the kindly lines harden, her mouth set into a thin, grim line. She finished the first page, her eyes flashing with a fire I rarely saw in her. That viper," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger. "That ungrateful, greedy little viper." She looked at me, her eyes full of a fierce, protective love. "Oh, my dear girl. I am so sorry." The simple empathy broke the dam again, and fresh tears spilled down my cheeks. "He's my brother, Grace." "My own brother." "I know, baby, I know." She pulled me into a hug, letting me cry on her shoulder like a child. When the kettle whistled, she made tea, lacing it with a generous spoonful of honey, just like she did when I was little, and had a skinned knee. "We need to call Clara," she said firmly, handing me a steaming mug. "Right now." I nodded, wiping my eyes. Clara was the strategist. Grace was the heart, but Clara was the spine. An hour later, Clara was seated in Grace's sitting room, the legal papers laid out neatly on the coffee table before her. She had read them in utter silence, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, her gaze was like flint. "Okay," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "The panic is over. Now we plan." I took a shuddering breath. "Plan what?" "He's suing me, Clara. He has a lawyer. What can I do?" "You can fight," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This isn't a death sentence, Ruth. It's a battle, and battles can be won." She tapped the document. "This family understanding is vague. It's his word against yours, and you have something he doesn't." "What?" I asked, desperate for any shred of hope. "You have the truth," she said simply. "And you have us, and you have this." She pointed a finger at my chest. "This fire I see in your eyes right now, that's the Ruth I remember. The one who didn't take nonsense from anyone. You've been asleep for a while, letting the world happen to you. Well, it's time to wake up and happen to the world." Her words were like a splash of cold water. She was right. The initial shock and grief were subsiding, and in their place, that initial white-hot fury was solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. "What's the first step?" I asked, my voice stronger now. "The first step," Clara said, "is to find you a lawyer. A pit bull. Not some genteel old man who plays golf with the other genteel old men. We need a fighter. I have a name." Grace leaned forward. "Who?" "Alicia Vance," Clara said. "Her practice is over in Millworth. She's young, sharp, and from what I hear, she eats guys like Mark's lawyer for breakfast. She specializes in property and inheritance law." "Alicia Vance," I repeated the name in my head. It sounded like a shield. A sword. "Call her," I said, looking from Clara's determined face to Grace's supportive one. "Make an appointment." Clara gave a sharp, approving nod. "Good. Grace, you'll go with her?" "Of course I will," Grace said, reaching for my hand and squeezing it tightly. I looked down at the legal papers, the source of my terror just an hour before. They still represented a profound threat, a long and difficult road ahead. But they didn't hold the same power over me. The first legal shot had been fired, but I was still standing. And I was no longer standing alone. The line had been drawn in the soil of my soul, and I was ready to defend it. The drive to Millworth the next day felt like crossing into a different country. My familiar world of winding back roads and weathered barns gave way to the outskirts of a small, bustling county seat. There were traffic lights, a courthouse square, and offices with polished brass nameplates. A place where things like lawsuits felt at home. I clutched the steering wheel, my knuckles aching from the tension. Grace sat beside me, a silent, calming presence, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't said much since we'd left, knowing I was lost in the storm of my own thoughts. "He used to put frogs in my bed," I said suddenly, the memory surfacing from the depths with painful clarity. Grace turned her head slowly. "Who did, honey?" "Mark. When we were kids. He'd find the biggest, slimiest toads and hide them under my covers. I'd get in and scream bloody murder." I gave a short, humorless laugh. My mother would scold him, but he'd just grin that little boy grin, all innocence. He liked getting a reaction. He liked knowing he could get under my skin. I fell silent, the truth of that childhood observation settling heavily between us. He still did. Only now, he wasn't using frogs. He was using lawyers and legal documents, and the scream he was trying to elicit was one of surrender. "People reveal themselves young, Ruth," Grace said softly. "We just don't want to believe it." We found the law office of Alicia Vance on the second floor of a red brick building overlooking the square. The waiting room was nothing like I'd imagined from Clara's description of a pit bull. It was warm and inviting, with comfortable chairs, tasteful art, and a serene, watercolor palette. A young, efficient-looking receptionist greeted us with a warm smile. "Mrs. Thompson, Miss Vance is expecting you. Can I get you some coffee or tea?" It was all so civilized. It felt disorienting. I'd braced myself for a cold, intimidating fortress, but this felt more like a sanctuary. Maybe that was a strategy in itself. We were shown into an office that was a reflection of the waiting room, warm, organized, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large, tidy desk. But the woman who rose from behind it was where Clara's description came to life. Alicia Vance was probably in her late 30s, with a sharp, intelligent face, dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and eyes that were both kind and intensely focused. She wore a simple, well-cut navy blue dress, no nonsense but elegant. She moved with a contained energy that was immediately reassuring. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, coming around the desk and shaking my hand with a firm, dry grip. "I'm Alicia Vance, and this must be Auntie Grace. Clara speaks very highly of you both. Please, have a seat." We settled into the plush chairs facing her desk. I handed her the dreaded manila envelope, my hands trembling slightly. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." "Of course," she said, her gaze already scanning the first page of the complaint. She read quickly, her expression neutral, but I saw a flicker in her eyes, not of worry, but of recognition, as if she were seeing a familiar, ugly pattern. She finished, set the papers down, and steepled her fingers. "Okay, Ruth, may I call you Ruth? Let's talk. First, I want you to understand something. This," she tapped the document, "is a scare tactic. It's designed to overwhelm you, to make you feel powerless, to pressure you into a quick, unfavorable settlement before you even have a chance to think. The fact that you're here in my office means their first move has already failed." Her words were like a life preserver thrown to a drowning woman. I hadn't even realized how much I needed to hear that I wasn't already defeated. "So, we can fight this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Alicia gave a small, confident smile. "Ruth, based on our phone call and what Clara has told me, we're not just going to fight it, we're going to win. But I need you to be my partner in this. I need you to be completely honest with me, and I need you to trust me, even when I ask you to do things that might feel difficult or invasive. Can you do that?" I looked at Grace, who gave me an encouraging nod, then back at Alicia's steady, capable gaze. "Yes," I said, and for the first time since the envelope had arrived, I felt a spark of something other than dread. It was resolve. "Good." She picked up a legal pad. "Now, let's start at the very beginning. Tell me about this land. Not just the legal details, but what it means to you. Tell me about Ben. And so, I did. For the next hour I talked. I told her about the first time Ben and I saw the property, about the dreams we'd woven into its overgrown fields. I told her about the blisters and the laughter, about planting the garden and the oak trees. I talked about the deep, abiding peace I'd found here after he was gone, the way the land itself had been my comfort. I told her about my parents, their love for the place, and their clear, unequivocal decision to leave it to me in their will. I didn't leave anything out. Not the joy, not the sorrow. Alicia listened, her pen occasionally jotting a note, but mostly just listening, her attention complete. When I finished, emotionally spent, but somehow lighter, she set her pen down. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That is the heart of our case. The law is about facts, but a case like this, it's also about a story, and your story is powerful. Now, let's talk facts." She became all business again. "I need you to find every document you have related to this property. The original deed from when you and Ben purchased it, your parents' wills, the probate records, tax records, mortgage discharge papers, anything and everything. I also need you to start keeping a journal." "A journal?" "A log of every interaction you have with Mark or Leo. Dates, times, what was said. If they call, if they show up, if they send a letter. Write it all down. It creates a timeline and a record of their behavior. It seems trivial, but it can be incredibly powerful." She then leaned forward slightly. "Now, about Leo living with you. That's a complication. He's established a physical presence in the home, which he might try to use to his advantage. We need to be very careful about how we handle that. For now, do not engage him in arguments. Be civil, but distant, document everything. Do not, under any circumstances, sign anything he or Mark gives you." It was a lot to take in. A to-do list for a war I never wanted to fight. But having a plan, having a general, made it feel manageable. "What about their claim?" I asked. "This family understanding?" Alicia's lips curved into a wry smile. "It's a common and frankly weak legal argument in cases like this. They're claiming a constructive trust, which essentially means they're arguing that while the title is in your name, you're really holding it for their benefit too, based on an oral promise or understanding. The burden of proof is on them. They have to provide clear and convincing evidence of this agreement. Do you have any reason to believe such an agreement ever existed?" "None," I said firmly. "My parents were clear. They helped Mark with a down payment on his first condo in the city. They left me the land. They knew he had no interest in it, and they knew it was my whole life." "Good. That's what we'll build on. We'll also subpoena Mark's financial records." In my experience, a sudden, aggressive move like this is often motivated by financial pressure. If we can show the court he's desperate, it undermines his credibility. The meeting ended with a list of tasks and a feeling of grim purpose. Alicia Vance was not a comforting presence in the way Grace was. She was a Cridas' take very strategic one. She was the commander, and I was the soldier being given my orders. As we walked out into the afternoon sunlight, I felt exhausted but clear-headed. "She's good," Grace said as we got into the truck. "You can just tell." "She is," I agreed. "But Grace, the cost. Lawyers, I don't have a lot of savings." Grace patted my arm. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Clara and I have a little put away. This is an investment in you and in that land. Don't you worry about that right now." The generosity, the sheer unwavering support, brought fresh tears to my eyes, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. When we got back to my house, Leo's car was gone. The silence felt like a reprieve. I went straight to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room, a piece I'd inherited from my father. It was where I kept all the important papers. I pulled out the heavy, leather-bound portfolio and began to sort through it. There was the deed to the land, with mine and Ben's names on it. There was the mortgage discharge paper, from when we'd finally paid it off, a day we'd celebrated with a bottle of cheap champagne on the porch. And there, in a separate folder, were my parents' wills. I unfolded my father's will, the paper crisp and formal. My eyes found the clause I was looking for. I hereby devise, give, and bequeath to my daughter, Ruth Ann Thompson, the real property located at 1873 Sycamore Ridge Road, to be hers alone, in fee simple, absolute. The language was dry, but to me, it was a love letter, a shield. There was no mention of Mark, no caveat, no family understanding. It was mine. Alone. I gathered all the documents, making a neat pile for Alicia. The simple, physical act of collecting this evidence was empowering. I was building my defense, brick by brick. That evening, Clara came over. The three of us, Grace, Clara, and I, sat around my kitchen table the way we had 1,000 times before. But tonight, the air was different. It was charged with purpose. A casserole Grace had brought sat largely untouched in the center of the table. "Okay," Clara began, her voice cutting through the quiet. "The lawyer is hired. The papers are gathered. Now we fortify." She looked directly at me. "You cannot let this break you, Ruth. They are counting on you being the fragile, grieving widow. They are counting on you being alone and easy to push around. So, you will not be fragile. You will be a rock." "How, Clara?" I asked, the weight of it all pressing down again. "How do I just be a rock?" "By remembering who you are," she said simply. "You are not just Ben's widow. You are the daughter of Henry and Eleanor Thompson, two of the toughest, most stubborn people God ever put on this earth. Your father built a business with his bare hands. Your mother held this family together through droughts and recessions. That blood is in your veins. And you are the woman who worked this farm alongside her husband, who knows every inch of this soil. You are a creator, a nurturer, a fighter. You have just forgotten." Grace reached out and covered my hand with hers. "She's right, honey. You have to feed that part of yourself now, the part that knows how to fight. And we're going to help," Clara said. She pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook from her bag and slapped it down on the table. "This is your war journal. You're going to write in it every day. Not just about Mark and Leo. You're going to write down one thing you did that day to strengthen your connection to this land. One thing you did for you. You fixed a fence. You baked a pie. You sat on the porch and watched the sunset and remembered why you're fighting. You document the attacks, but you also document your resilience. Do you understand?" It was such a Clara thing to do, to turn a legal necessity into a tool for personal strength. The journal wasn't just for the case. It was for me. "I understand," I said, my voice stronger. "Good." Clara leaned back. "Now, the other thing. You are not to isolate yourself. We are your counsel. You will report to us. You will vent to us. You will cry with us if you need to, but you will not pull away and try to carry this by yourself. That is an order." A small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in days. "Yes, ma'am." Later, after they had left, and the house was quiet once more, I took the new notebook and a pen. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Leo had presented his co-ownership papers. I opened to the first page. October 18th, I wrote. Legal, received formal complaint. Hired Alicia Vance. Gathered initial documents. Personal, split a cord of wood. My body is sore, but it felt good to use my hands. Met with Grace and Clara. I am not alone. I closed the notebook. It was a start. I walked to the back door and looked out at the night. The moon was a sliver, casting a faint silver light over the meadow. The land was sleeping, peaceful and unaware of the human turmoil unfolding upon it. But I was aware. I was its guardian. Leo's headlights appeared down the lane. The reprieve was over. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but it was different now. It wasn't the knot of blind panic, it was the knot of readiness. The first legal shot had been fired, but I had gathered my allies. I had a plan. I had a lawyer, I had my aunties, and I was beginning to remember the fighter buried deep inside me. He came in the door, smelling of fast food and cool night air. He glanced at me sitting at the table but said nothing, heading straight for the stairs. "Leo," I said, my voice calm and even. He paused, one foot on the bottom step, and looked back at me, his expression wary. "I've retained an attorney," I said, holding his gaze. "Alicia Vance. All future communication regarding the property will need to go through her." His eyes narrowed slightly, the wariness shifting into a flicker of surprise and perhaps a hint of respect. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears and pleading, not a formal declaration. "Fine," he said curtly and continued up the stairs. I listened to his footsteps fade, then looked down at my new journal. I picked up the pen and added one more line. "He knows I'm fighting back." The days that followed settled into a strange and exhausting new rhythm. The house was no longer a home. It was a battlefield drawn along invisible lines. My territory was the kitchen, the living room, my bedroom. Leo's was the spare room, the bathroom, and the barn, where he'd spend hours. The sounds of him tinkering with tools a constant, low-level irritation. We were two opposing forces occupying the same space, a cold war fought with silence and averted glances. The air itself felt thick, charged with unspoken accusations and a shared, simmering anger. My journal became my confidant, my anchor in the chaos. October 21st, I wrote, my hand moving steadily across the page. Legal, overnighted document package to Alicia Vance. She confirmed receipt, waiting for her review. Personal, repaired the loose step on the porch. The hammer felt good in my hand. Solid, definitive. Each strike of the nail was a message. I am still here. I am fixing what is broken. The personal entry was Clara's prescription, and it was working. The small, tangible acts of maintenance were a rebellion against the narrative Leo and Mark were trying to build that I was letting the place fall apart. Every repaired hinge, every painted windowsill, was a quiet declaration of my competence, my care. But the emotional toll was relentless. Living with the enemy was a form of psychological torture. I'd find myself listening for his movements, my body tense, unable to relax even in my own kitchen. The simple act of making a meal became a strategic operation. Could I get it done and be out of the room before he came in? I started eating earlier, or later, just to avoid the awkward, heavy silence of shared meals. The home that had always been my sanctuary had been violated, its peace replaced by a constant, humming anxiety. One afternoon, I was in the living room, attempting to lose myself in a novel, when Leo came in from outside. He didn't go upstairs. Instead, he stood in the doorway, watching me. I could feel his gaze like a physical weight, but I refused to look up from my book. "You know, this doesn't have to be so difficult, Ruth," he said, his voice breaking the fragile silence. I slowly lowered my book, meeting his eyes. They were calm, calculating. "You sued me, Leo. You're living in my house under false pretenses. I'd say that makes things inherently difficult." He sighed, a theatrical sound of exasperation. "We're not suing you. We're seeking a legal clarification. There's a difference. This could all be settled amicably. You could avoid a long, expensive court battle. We could be a family again." The audacity of it took my breath away. "A family? You hold a knife to my throat and call it family?" "It's not a knife, it's a reality check," he said, his voice rising slightly. He took a step into the room. "Look at this place. It's a museum, Ruth. A museum to a dead man and a life that's over. You're clinging to a ghost while the real world is passing you by. Dad and I are offering you a way out. A way to be free of all this. This weight." His words were meant to wound, to undermine my reality. But this time, they sparked a different fire. Not just anger, but a cold, clear certainty. "This weight is my life," I said, my voice low and steady. "This ghost is the man I loved. This museum is my home. And you are a guest here who has long overstayed his welcome. There will be no amicable settlement. The only thing I want from you and your father is for you to leave me alone." His face hardened, the last vestiges of the charming nephew evaporating. "You're making a huge mistake. You're going to lose, and when you do, you'll get nothing. We're trying to be generous. Get out of this room," I said, turning my gaze back to my book, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard him mutter something under his breath, then his footsteps retreated up the stairs. I didn't pick up the story again. I just sat there, trembling, the words on the page a meaningless blur. The confrontation had left me shaken, but also, perversely, stronger. I had stood my ground. I had looked him in the eye and refused his version of reality. That evening, I called Grace. I needed to hear a friendly voice. I told her about the exchange, my words tumbling out in a rushed, angry torrent. "Oh, honey," she sighed, and I could picture her shaking her head, her kind face lined with worry. "That boy has his father's poison in him. You just remember, his words are meant to make you doubt yourself. Don't you listen. You are the sanest person I know." After I hung up, her reassurance lingered, a warm ember in the cold house. I knew what I had to do next. Alicia had asked for every document, and that meant delving deeper than the modern files in the roll-top desk. It meant facing a past I had kept carefully boxed away. The attic? I hadn't been up there in years. I pulled the string for the folding stairs, the sound of its descent groaning through the quiet hall. A puff of dust motes danced in the hallway light. I climbed up, the old wooden steps creaking in protest under my weight. The attic was a time capsule, filled with the gentle, accumulated ghosts of a lifetime. Trunks and cardboard boxes were stacked beneath the slanted eaves, shrouded in a fine, gray layer of dust. The air was still and thick, smelling of old paper, cedar, and memories. To my left were Ben's things, boxes of his clothes I could never bring myself to donate, his fishing tackle, a set of golf clubs growing a fine patina of rust. I turned away from them, my heart constricting. That was a pain for another day. I turned to the right, where my parents' things were stored. I found what I was looking for, a stack of my father's old business boxes, labeled in his precise, blocky handwriting, H. Thompson, ledgers and receipts. My father, Henry Thompson, had run a small, successful hardware store in town. He was a man of meticulous order, who believed the truth of a man's life was in his accounts. He kept detailed ledgers, logging every nail and bolt sold, every profit and loss. He had done all his own bookkeeping in large, cloth-bound ledger books until the day he retired. I dragged two of the heaviest boxes over to the dim circle of light cast by the single bare bulb hanging from the rafters. I sat on the dusty floorboards, cross-legged, and opened the first one. The smell of old paper and ink rose to meet me. I pulled out the top ledger. It was from the 1972nd, the pages filled with columns of my father's neat numbers. I set it aside. I needed the years surrounding my wedding, the time when the land transfer had happened. I found the ledger for the year Ben and I were married. My heart beat a little faster as I opened it. This wasn't just numbers. This was the story of my life, written in my father's hand. I saw entries for building supplies, lumber, bags of concrete, plumbing fixtures. He had given us a steep family discount, I remembered with a pang of gratitude. He and Ben had spent weekends here, building the new porch, repairing the roof. I ran my fingers over the numbers, seeing the sweat and love they represented. Then, I found it. Not in the main part of the ledger, but in the back, where he sometimes noted larger, personal transactions. On a page titled Family Matters, there was an entry dated a month after our wedding. August 12th, he had written, "Finalized land transfer to Ruth and Ben. Consideration, love and affection. May they build a happy life there." My breath caught. It was so simple, so beautiful. Consideration, love and affection. In the dry, legalistic world of the lawsuit, this was a pure, unassailable truth. He hadn't sold it to us, he had given it to us, as a gift, a blessing for our future. But I kept looking. I felt a pull, a need to be thorough. I found the ledger for the following year. And there, on a similar page in the back, was another entry. September 5th, it read. Provided Mark with $25,000 inheritance advance for down payment on city property. He has chosen his path. Wishes him well. I stared at the entry, my blood running cold. $25,000. In those days, that was a fortune. A down payment on a city property. It was the exact opposite of a family understanding that included him in this land. It was a clear, financial demarcation. He got his inheritance in cash to invest in his city life. I got mine in land to build the life I wanted here. My father had been scrupulously, characteristically fair. This was it. This was the evidence that could shatter their entire case. This wasn't a vague memory or my word against theirs. This was my father's own meticulous record, written in black ink, decades ago, with no thought of future litigation. It was the unvarnished truth. A fierce, triumphant joy surged through me. I wanted to shout, to run downstairs and wave the ledger in Leo's face. But I stopped myself. Clara's voice echoed in my head. Be strategic. Don't show your hand. I carefully, reverently, closed the ledger. I held it to my chest, feeling the solid weight of it. It was more than a book. It was a shield, a weapon, my father's voice speaking from the past to protect me in the present. The dust of the attic, the chill in the air, none of it mattered. I had been digging for documents, but I had unearthed vindication. I carried the two crucial ledgers down from the attic as if they were holy relics. I didn't put them with the other papers, for Alicia. Instead, I hid them in the bottom of my own bedroom closet, under a stack of winter sweaters. I would tell Alicia about them, of course, but they wouldn't leave this house until she needed them. They were my secret, my comfort. That night, I wrote in my journal with a new sense of purpose. October 25th. Legal, discovered father's ledgers in the attic. Clear entries detailing land gift to me and Ben, and a $25,000 cash inheritance to Mark for a city property. This is the truth. Personal. The past is not always a ghost. Sometimes it is a foundation. Father built me a foundation of truth, and I was standing on it all along. I am not afraid of Leo's words anymore. I have my father's. The next morning, I called Alicia. I tried to keep my voice calm, but the excitement leaked through. I found something, in my father's old ledgers. I read her the entries over the phone. There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then I heard her let out a low, appreciative whistle. Ruth, that is fantastic. That is exactly the kind of contemporaneous evidence that judges love. It's unbiased, it's detailed, and it completely contradicts their claim. Don't let anyone know you have it. We'll introduce it at the right time. After I hung up, I felt 10 feet tall. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the land. The autumn sun was bright, setting the golden leaves of the birch trees ablaze. I saw Leo walking from the barn toward the house, and for the first time, I didn't feel a clench of dread. I felt a strange, calm pity. He and his father were building their case on a lie, and I was standing on a foundation of my father's truth. They were trying to take my land, but they had no idea how deep my roots really went. He came in the back door, his presence once again an intrusion, but it no longer had the power to shatter my peace. He glanced at me, and I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He was accustomed to seeing tension in my shoulders, anxiety in my face. Today, he saw none of it. Today, he saw a woman who was standing on solid ground. Morning, I said, my voice neutral, almost pleasant. He stared at me for a beat too long, suspicious. Morning, he grunted, and headed for the coffee pot. I turned back to the window, a small, private smile touching my lips. The war wasn't over, but I had just won a critical battle. I had unearthed the past, and it had armed me for the future. The discovery of the ledgers changed everything. It was as if I had been navigating a dark, treacherous forest, clutching a flickering candle, and someone had suddenly handed me a brilliant, steady floodlight. The fear didn't vanish, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, clear-eyed certainty. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. I was a strategist studying a map of the battlefield. And I held the key to the enemy's fortifications. This new perspective sharpened my senses. Living with Leo became less about enduring a siege and more about gathering intelligence. Every interaction, every overheard phone conversation fragment was a piece of a puzzle I was now confidently assembling. The war journal Clara had insisted upon evolved from a log of grievances into an intelligence dossier. October 28th, I wrote, my script neat and deliberate. Legal. Informed Alicia of ledger discovery. She is delighted. Advise continued discretion. Our case is solidifying. Observation. Elle received a lengthy phone call this evening. Heard him in his room, voice low but agitated. Phrases caught, pushing back. Need more than that. Her lawyer is a problem. Clearly discussing the case. Sounded frustrated. Good. I was learning to listen not just to words but to tone. The easy confidence he'd projected when he first arrived was gone, replaced by a simmering irritability. He spent more time on the phone, his voice often tight with strain. He was feeling the pressure. Alicia Vance was, as Clara had promised, a problem for them. A few days later, a formal-looking letter arrived for Leo. It was from the Barlow and Finch law firm, Mark's lawyers. He snatched it from the kitchen counter, where the mail was piled, his movements quick and nervous. He didn't open it in front of me, but retreated to his room. An hour later, I heard him on the phone again, his voice louder, clearer, bleeding through the floorboards. She's not budging, Dad. I told you. The nice nephew act only got us so far. No, she's not the pushover you thought she was. Well, maybe your understanding wasn't as clear as you remember. The last sentence was a snarl. I froze, a dish halfway to the drying rack. There it was, the first crack in their unified front. Leo was questioning his father's story. The family understanding, the very foundation of their case, was showing its fragility, even to one of its architects. I finished drying the dish slowly, methodically, a plan forming in my mind. It was time to stop just observing. It was time to test the walls of his story. The opportunity came that evening. He came into the kitchen, looking for something to eat. I was sitting at the table, ostensibly reading a seed catalog, the ledger from the year of my wedding, sitting innocently beside my elbow. I had placed it there deliberately. He opened the refrigerator, his back to me. The tension in the room was a live wire. It's a beautiful piece of land, isn't it, Leo? I said, my voice conversational. He stiffened slightly, then closed the fridge door, empty-handed. He turned and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. It has potential. Wasted, but it's there. Potential for what? I asked, looking up from the catalog. For more condos? For a strip mall? For something that actually generates an income, he retorted. For something that isn't just a sentimental drain on resources. I let the insult slide off me. I tapped the cover of the ledger with my finger. My father didn't see it that way. He saw it as a foundation. A place to build a life. Leo's eyes flicked to the old book, then back to my face. Times change. What worked for one generation doesn't always work for the next. Some things don't change, I said softly. Like promises. Like gifts given in good faith. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Your grandfather was a man of his word, Leo. He believed in writing things down. He believed in clarity. A wary, calculating look entered his eyes. He was trying to figure out where I was going with this. What's that supposed to mean? I opened the ledger, not to the crucial page, but to a random section filled with columns of hardware sales. It means he kept a record of everything. Every transaction, big or small. He was a very thorough man. I saw a flicker of unease cross his face, quickly masked. I'm sure he was. But some family matters aren't about transactions, Ruth. They're about understandings, are they? I met his gaze and held it. Your father received a significant inheritance from his parents, too, you know. Around the same time Ben and I got this land. $25,000. A fortune back then. Meant for a down payment on a property in the city, which is exactly what he used it for. The color drained from Leo's face. It was a subtle shift, but unmistakable. He hadn't known. Mark had either lied to him or omitted this crucial piece of information. The narrative he'd been fed that my parents had always intended for the land to be shared was crumbling before his eyes, and he was realizing he'd built his case on a foundation of sand. Where did you hear that? He asked, his voice tight. I didn't hear it, I said calmly, closing the ledger with a soft, definitive thud. I read it. In my father's own handwriting, dated, specific, just like the entry where he gifted this land to me and Ben. It was all very clear, Leo. There was no understanding. There was a division of assets. Your father got his share in cash. I got mine in land. He stared at me, his jaw working. I could see the gears turning in his head, the frantic recalibration. The confident, manipulative nephew was gone, replaced by a young man who was beginning to understand he'd been used as a pawn in his father's greedy game. That doesn't prove anything, he finally said, but the words lacked conviction. They were a reflex, a last-ditch effort to hold his ground. It proves everything, I said quietly, and it's going to prove it to a judge. I stood up, picking up the ledger. I didn't say another word. I just walked out of the kitchen and left him standing there, alone with the wreckage of his father's lie. The confrontation had been nothing like our previous arguments. There had been no shouting, no overt cruelty. It had been a quiet, surgical strike, and I had landed a direct hit on the heart of their case. The following day, I had a scheduled phone consultation with Alicia. I told her about the conversation, about Leo's reaction. Excellent, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. You're getting under their skin. A shaky plaintiff is a weak plaintiff. Now I have some news from my end. I've started the discovery process, and I've had my private investigator do some digging on your brother's financials. And? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. And it's exactly what I suspected, Alicia said, her tone turning crisp and professional. Mark's real estate ventures have taken a significant hit in the last 2 years. He's over-leveraged, and a major commercial project he was banking on fell through. He's facing substantial debt. This lawsuit isn't just about a shared inheritance, it's a Hail Mary pass. He needs a liquid asset, and quickly. Your land is his lifeline. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't just about greed or a twisted sense of entitlement, it was about desperation. Mark was drowning, and he saw my home as a life raft. The cold, calculating nature of it took my breath away. He was willing to destroy me, to desecrate our parents' memory, to save his own skin. This makes him dangerous, Ruth, Alicia cautioned. A cornered animal is an unpredictable one, but it also makes him vulnerable. In court, we can paint a very clear picture. A desperate man, fabricating a story to get his hands on his sister's property to solve his own financial problems. It completely undermines his credibility. After I hung up with Alicia, I felt a profound and weary sadness. The web of lies was now fully visible to me. Mark's financial ruin had led him to concoct a story about a family understanding. He had then sent his son, my own nephew, to infiltrate my home, to be his eyes and ears, to soften me up, and then to pressure me when I proved resistant. It was a cold, premeditated campaign of manipulation. The brother I had known was truly gone, consumed by his own avarice and desperation. I needed air. I needed to be away from the house, from the oppressive presence of Leo, from the weight of this ugly knowledge. I put on my jacket and walked out into the late autumn afternoon. I walked past the barn, down toward the creek that marked the western boundary of the property. The air was cool and clean, scented with damp earth and decaying leaves. The creek murmured its endless, soothing song. I stood on the bank, watching the water swirl around the smooth, gray stones. This was the place Ben and I had always come to when we needed to think, to talk, to just be. I could feel him here now, not as a ghost, but as a memory so vivid it was almost a presence. What would you do, Ben? I thought. Would you be as sad as I am? Or would you just be angry? And as clearly as if he were standing beside me, I knew the answer. He would be sad for a moment, for the loss of a family that should have been a sanctuary. And then he would get angry. And then he would fight. A resolve, harder and more durable than any I had felt before, settled in my bones. This was no longer just about protecting a piece of land. It was about justice. It was about holding a liar and a manipulator accountable. It was about proving that truth and love were stronger than desperation and greed. When I walked back to the house, the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows. Leo's car was still there, but the house felt different. It felt like my house again. Because I had reclaimed it, not through a legal deed, but through the strength of my own spirit. I had looked into the heart of the web of lies, and I was not afraid. I went to my journal that night and made my entry with a steady hand. November 2nd, legal. Alicia confirms Mark's financial desperation is the motive. The lawsuit is a financial rescue attempt, built on a fabricated story. Personal, confronted L. with the truth about the $25,000. He was shaken, the puppet saw his strings. I walked the land and spoke with Ben. I am not fighting for a memory, I am fighting for a truth. And I will win. The confrontation in the kitchen had irrevocably shifted the balance of power in the house. Leo no longer moved with the sullen, entitled confidence of a predator marking its territory. Now, he moved like a ghost, a skittish, shadowy presence. He avoided me assiduously, his comings and goings timed to ensure our paths rarely crossed. When they did, he wouldn't meet my eyes. The knowledge I had imparted the existence of his father's $25,000 inheritance had severed the last thread of his moral certainty. He was living in a house of cards, and he now knew I held the wind that could blow it all down. My journal entries became shorter, more focused. The emotional turmoil was being refined into a cold, hard purpose. November 5th, legal. Awaiting formal discovery responses from Mark's counsel, Alicia anticipates delays and obfuscation. Observation: L is avoiding me. The silence is no longer hostile, it is guilty, he knows. The atmosphere, however, was still poisonous. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the tense, breathless quiet before a storm. I found myself spending more and more time out of the house, finding solace in the physical work of preparing the land for winter. I pruned the apple trees, their sleeping forms promising a future I was now fiercely determined to see. I cleared the gutters of fallen leaves, a mundane task that felt like clearing the clutter from my own mind. Each chore was a meditation, a reaffirmation of my stewardship. It was during one of these tasks, mending a section of the split-rail fence along the northern pasture, that I saw the car. It wasn't Leo's sedan or Mark's expensive SUV. It was a nondescript, dark vehicle that moved too slowly down the county road, pausing opposite my property line. A man I didn't recognize was in the driver's seat, and he seemed to be taking photographs, not of the scenic autumn foliage, but with a long lens, focused intently on the house, the barn. My blood ran cold. It felt invasive, predatory. I straightened up, the hammer heavy in my hand, and stared directly at the car. The driver noticed me, seemed to hesitate for a moment, then quickly pulled away, kicking up a plume of gravel dust. I marched back to the house, my heart pounding with a fresh, indignant anger. I went straight to the landline in the kitchen and called Alicia. There was a man, I said, my voice shaking slightly. In a car, taking pictures of the house. Of me, I think. Alicia let out a sigh that was more weary than surprised. I was expecting something like this. It's likely an investigator working for their side. They're probably trying to build a visual case for neglect or disrepair to support their claim that you're an incapable owner. Or they're looking for any unpermitted structures. It's a cheap tactic. A cheap tactic, I repeated, outraged. It feels like being stalked. It is, in a way, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. But it's also a sign of weakness. They're scrambling for evidence because their core argument is hollow. Remember the ledgers, Ruth. They have a grainy photo of a loose shingle. You have your father's handwritten truth. Now, from this point on, be aware of your surroundings. If you see that car again, get the license plate. And don't engage. I hung up, feeling violated. The battle was no longer confined to legal papers and tense household silences. It was spilling out onto my land, threatening the very privacy I held so dear. I looked out the window, at the peaceful, sun-dappled meadow, and it felt like it was under a new, invisible siege. That evening, the storm that had been brewing in the silence finally broke. I was in the living room, the ledgers now kept in a locked firebox in my bedroom closet, reading a book. Leo came down the stairs, dressed to go out, but he didn't head for the door. He stood in the archway, his coat on, his keys jangling in his hand. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was different. Stripped of all pretense, it was flat, hard, and businesslike. I marked my page and set the book down slowly. "I believe I've made it clear that all communication should go through my attorney." "This isn't about communication," he said. "This is about an offer." "A final offer?" I said nothing, just waited, my expression neutral. "Dad is willing to settle," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine. And in them, I saw the same cold calculation I'd seen in his father's eyes that first day. "You sign over a 50% interest in the property to me. We become partners. I handle the management, the liabilities, the development potential. You get to stay in the house, rent-free, for your lifetime. It's more than fair." I stared at him, truly stunned by the sheer, breathtaking audacity. After everything, the lies, the manipulation, the lawsuit, the investigator, they were still trying to win. They thought they could just take half. They thought I was so worn down, so afraid of a court battle, that I would capitulate. "Development potential," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "It's the only way this land makes financial sense," he said, as if explaining something simple to a child. "We could subdivide the back 10 acres, put in a half-dozen high-end home sites. The value would skyrocket. Your share, even at 50%, would be more than you'd ever see just sitting on it." He was describing the desecration of my home, the destruction of the meadow, the felling of the oak trees, as if it were a sensible business plan. He saw a legacy. He saw a subdivision. "You want to cut my land into pieces," I said, standing up. "You want to sell off my memories, my peace, my life with Ben, to strangers so you and your father can solve your financial problems. It's not about that," he snapped, his composure cracking. "It's about realizing an asset's true value. It's about not being stupid." The word hung in the air between us, ugly and final. "Get out," I said, my voice low and trembling, with a fury so pure it felt like ice. "What?" "Get out of my house," I repeated, each word a shard of glass. "Now. You are no longer welcome here. You have 30 minutes to pack your things and leave. If you are not gone, I will call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing." He laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. "You can't do that. I live here." "You are a guest," I fire back, my voice rising. "A guest who has abused my hospitality, lied to me, and conspired to steal my home. Your tenancy is revoked. Get out." For a long moment, we stood, locked in a silent battle of wills. The mask was completely off. There was no nephew, no aunt. There were just two adversaries in a fight for a kingdom of soil and soul. "You're making a mistake you'll regret," he said, his voice a low growl. "The only thing I regret," I said, my gaze unwavering, "is ever opening my door to you." He turned then, and stormed up the stairs. I heard the violent sounds of drawers opening and closing, of items being thrown into a suitcase. I didn't move. I stood my ground in the living room, my entire body thrumming with adrenaline and righteous anger. 15 minutes later, he came clattering down the stairs, dragging his suitcase. He didn't look at me. He yanked open the front door, the cool night air rushing in. "This isn't over," he said, his back to me. "It is for you," I replied. "You lost the moment you walked in here with a lie in your heart." He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled in their frames. A moment later, I heard his car engine roar to life, the tires spinning on the gravel as he sped away down the dark lane. The silence that descended was absolute. It was different from the tense quiet of before. This was a deep, profound, and healing silence. The poison had been physically expelled. I was alone, truly, completely alone in my house for the first time in weeks. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the sudden emptiness. I went into the spare room. It was stripped bare, the closet empty, the bed stripped. It smelled faintly of his cologne. I opened the window wide, letting the cold, clean night air wash the scent of betrayal away. I felt no triumph. Only a vast, weary relief. It was over. The invasion was over. The first part of the war was won. I had reclaimed my sanctuary. I went to the kitchen and did something I hadn't done in weeks. I made a cup of tea and sat at my table in my kitchen, in my house, and I simply breathed. I looked around at the familiar, beloved sights, the chipped paint on the windowsill, the view of the moon rising over the barn, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It was all mine again. I picked up my journal. My hand was steady. November 8th, legal. They made a settlement offer, 50/50 partnership and lifetime tenancy for me. I refused. Personal. I evicted Leo. He is gone. The house is mine again. The air is clean. I am unafraid. The lie has left the building. The silence after Leo's departure was a living thing. It wasn't the hollow, anxious silence of his presence, but a deep, resonant quiet that settled into the very bones of the house, like a healing balm. For the first hour, I just wandered. I ran my hand over the doorframe of the spare room, now just a room again, not an occupied territory. I sat on the edge of the stripped bed, listening to the old house creak and sigh around me, sounds I knew as well as my own heartbeat. They were comforting sounds now, the sounds of home, not the prelude to an argument or a confrontation. I felt a profound exhaustion, the kind that follows a great physical exertion. Throwing him out had taken every ounce of my courage, and now the adrenaline had faded, leaving me hollowed out but clean. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary, sad peace. I had done what needed to be done. I called Grace first. Her voice, warm with relief and pride, was a blanket around my shoulders. "Oh, thank the Lord, honey. You did it, you got your house back." Then I called Clara. Her response was characteristically blunt. "About damn time. Now, change the locks tomorrow. First thing. Don't wait. Do you really think he'd try to come back?" "I think a cornered rat will try any hole it can find," she said flatly. "You don't give it the opportunity. Change the locks." And so, the next morning, that was my first order of business. I drove into town to the hardware store my father had once owned, a place that still felt like a second home. Old Joe, who'd worked for my dad, was behind the counter. His eyes, crinkled with 1,000 laugh lines, grew serious when I asked for new deadbolts for all my exterior doors. "Trouble, Ruth?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "A little family trouble, Joe," I said, offering a small, tired smile. "Just being cautious." He nodded, a world of understanding in his eyes. "Your dad was a cautious man, a good man. He'd want you to be safe." He not only sold me the locks but insisted on giving me his personal, heavy-duty screwdriver to install them with. "Bring it back when you're done," he said, pressing it into my hand. It was more than a tool, it was a token of support from the community my family had been part of for generations. Installing the locks was a physical, cathartic act. Each turn of the screw, each solid thunk as the new, heavy deadbolt slid into place, was a declaration. I am safe. This is mine. When I was done, I stood on the porch, the old key that had fit the previous lock now useless in my hand. I threw it as far as I could into the overgrown meadow. A small, symbolic gesture, but it felt good. The house was truly, legally, and physically mine again. But the war was not over. The lawsuit was still a dark cloud on the horizon. With Leo gone, however, I could finally think. I could plan. I could breathe. My first deliberate act of reclamation was to bake an apple pie. It was a simple thing, but it felt deeply significant. I used the last of the season's apples from my own trees, the ones Ben and I had planted. The scent of cinnamon and sugar and baking crust filled the house, overriding the last lingering psychic traces of Leo's presence. It was the smell of home, of normalcy, of love. While the pie cooled on the windowsill, I did what I had been avoiding. I went back up to the attic. This time, I didn't go for my father's ledgers. I went for Ben's things. The trunk was where I'd left it, a silent, dust-shrouded monument to my grief. I knelt before it, my heart pounding a different, older rhythm of pain. I hadn't opened it in years. The clasp was stiff, but it gave way with a rusty shriek. The smell that rose from the trunk was him. A faint mix of sawdust, his particular soap, and the cedar lining of the chest. On top lay his old, worn flannel shirt, the blue and black one he'd loved. I lifted it to my face and inhaled, and for a moment, the years fell away. The pain was there, sharp and fresh, but it was a clean pain. It was the pain of love, not the corrosive acid of betrayal I'd been living with. Underneath the shirt were photographs. Us, young and ridiculous, standing in front of the dilapidated house we were so proud of. Ben grinning, with a gigantic zucchini from our first garden. The two of us on the porch swing, his arm around me, my head on his shoulder. We looked so happy, so sure of our future. I hadn't been able to look at these for so long. The loss had been too great. But now, surrounded by the threat Mark and Leo posed, these pictures weren't just reminders of what I'd lost, they were proof of what I'd had. They were the why. This was why I was fighting. For that love, for that happiness, for the life we built. I took a few of the photographs downstairs and put them in frames, placing them around the living room. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were allies. They were my history, my foundation. A few days after the eviction, my phone rang. It was Mark. I hadn't heard from him directly since this all began. I almost didn't answer, but a fierce, stubborn part of me wanted to hear what he had to say. I picked up. "Hello, Mark. What the hell did you do to my son?" His voice was a snarl, stripped of all pretense. "I asked him to leave my home," I said, my voice calm. "After he presented me with an ultimatum to hand over half of it. He had every right to be there. We have a claim." "You have a lawsuit, Mark," I corrected him. "A flimsy one, based on a lie. You have no claim on my heart, or on my home. And you have no right to send your son to do your dirty work." There was a silence on the other end, filled only with his ragged breathing. I could feel his fury radiating through the phone. "You always were selfish, Ruth. Always hoarding everything for yourself. Mom and Dad's attention. This land. You never thought about what I needed." The petulance in his voice, the sheer, staggering lack of self-awareness, was breathtaking. This was the core of it. This childish resentment, festering for decades, had finally erupted into this legal and emotional violence. "I'm done with this conversation, Mark," I said, my voice weary. "All communication goes through my lawyer. Don't call this number again." I hung up. My hand was trembling, but my spirit was steady. I had looked my monster in the eye, and I had not flinched. The next week, I invited Grace and Clara for dinner. A proper dinner, at my table, in my reclaimed home. It was a clear, cold night, and I had a fire crackling in the hearth. The smell of the pie I'd baked still lingered, mingling with the scent of the stew simmering on the stove. When they arrived, their arms full of wine and fresh bread, they both stopped in the doorway, sensing the change immediately. "Well, now," Clara said, her sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in the new photographs, the clean, peaceful atmosphere. "This is more like it," Grace beamed, her eyes misty. "It feels like your house again, Ruth. It feels like you." We sat around the table, the three of us, just like old times. But it wasn't just like old times. It was better. We had passed through a fire together. "He called," I said, serving the stew. "Mark." Both of them looked up, their spoons hovering. "And?" Clara prompted. "And I told him to speak to my lawyer." I said it simply, and took a bite of stew. Clara's lips curved into a slow, approving smile. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, honey," Grace said. "We both are," Clara added. "You're not just surviving this, you're winning." After dinner, we sat by the fire with glasses of wine. The conversation turned away from lawsuits and betrayals. We talked about Grace's garden, about a trip Clara was thinking of taking, about the book I was reading. It was normal. It was healing. Later, after they had gone and I was alone again, I stood at the back door, looking out at the night. The moon was full, bathing the land in a silvery light. The meadow was a sea of shimmering frost. The oak trees stood as black, silent sentinels. I thought of Ben. I thought of my father's ledger, hidden safely away. I thought of the new, solid deadbolts on my doors. I thought of the pie, the photographs, the dinner with my friends. Leo was gone. Mark's poison had been pushed back beyond my walls. The legal battle still loomed, but the siege of my spirit was over. I had evicted more than just my nephew from this house. I had evicted the fear, the doubt, the feeling of being a victim. I had filled the space he left not with more silence, but with memory, with friendship, with the simple, defiant act of baking a pie. I was rooted here, deeper than any lawsuit could reach. The eviction was complete. I went to my journal that night, the fire embers still glowing in the hearth. November 15th, legal, no new filings, the calm before the storm. Personal, changed the locks, baked a pie, brought Ben's photos downstairs, had Grace and Clara over for dinner. The house is full of the right kind of ghosts again. My ghosts, my allies. I am home. The letter from the court arrived 2 weeks later, a crisp, official summons to a mandatory mediation session. Alicia had prepared me for it. "It's a box they have to check," she'd said over the phone, her voice a study in calm professionalism. "A judge orders it to see if the parties can be reasonable before clogging up a courtroom. Don't expect reason. Expect theater. Mark will perform. Your job is to be the unmovable object to his irresistible force." The mediation was scheduled in the same Millworth Courthouse annex where Alicia had her office. The morning of, I dressed with deliberate care. I chose a simple, navy blue dress I'd worn to a friend's wedding years ago, one that made me feel both dignified and strong. I brushed my hair until it shone, applied a faint touch of lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back had lines of strain around her eyes, but her gaze was steady. She was a landowner, a widow, a survivor. She was not a victim. Grace drove me, a silent pillar of support. She waited in the car, a sentinel with a knitting project, while I walked into the cool, marble-floored building. Alicia met me in the lobby, looking every bit the pit bull in a sleek, black suit. "Remember," she said, tucking her arm through mine in a surprisingly maternal gesture. "You hold all the cards, the ledgers, the truth, the moral high ground. They have bluster and a desperate story. Just watch the performance." We were shown into a sterile, windowless conference room. A long, polished table dominated the space. A neutral mediator, a kindly-looking man with a tired expression, sat at the head, and on the other side were Mark and Leo. It was the first time I'd seen my brother since this nightmare began. He looked older, the successful sheen he'd always worn now seeming like a cheap veneer. There were new lines of tension around his mouth, and his eyes held a hard, frantic glint. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but it couldn't hide the strain. Leo sat beside him, looking uncomfortable in a stiff blazer, his gaze fixed on the table. He couldn't look at me. With them was their lawyer, a man named Mr. Sterling from Barlow and Finch. He was everything Alicia was not: oily, with a too-smooth smile and a patronizing demeanor. He looked like a man who was used to winning by outspending and outlasting his opponents. The mediator began with a speech about the benefits of finding a collaborative solution, about saving time and money. His words washed over me. I was too focused on the charged silence from across the table. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he leaned forward, his hands clasped, and put on a show of pained reasonableness. "Ruth," he began, his voice dripping with a false, brotherly concern that made my skin crawl. "I just want what's fair. For all of us. This land. It was always meant to be a part of our family's legacy. Mom and Dad would be heartbroken to see us like this." I said nothing. I just looked at him, letting the silence amplify the emptiness of his words. Mr. Sterling took over, sliding a bound document across the table. "My client is prepared to be exceedingly generous. We are offering a structured settlement. Ruth would retain a life estate in the primary residence and 1 acre. The remaining 9 acres would be transferred to a jointly held LLC, managed by my client and his son, for responsible development. This provides Ruth with security and allows the family to realize the property's full potential." I glanced at the document but didn't touch it. I looked at Alicia. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, then turned her cool gaze to Mr. Sterling. "Your offer is noted and rejected. My client's position is unchanged. She is the sole legal and beneficial owner of the property in its entirety. There is no family legacy to discuss beyond the one her parents clearly delineated in their wills and their financial records." Mark's mask of reasonableness cracked. "Financial records? What financial records?" he snapped, his eyes darting to me with a flicker of panic. Alicia didn't flinch. "We have compelling documentary evidence that clearly outlines the separate inheritances you and your sister received. There was no understanding, Mark. There was a division of assets. You took yours in cash and invested it in your life in the city. Ruth invested hers in this land." "It's a lie!" Mark slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. The mediator flinched. "She's twisting things. That money was a loan. Dad would never have cut me out. Your father's own ledgers from the year in question state otherwise," Alicia said, her voice like calm, still water. "They clearly describe it as an inheritance advance for your city property. The entry for Ruth's land describes it as a gift. The language is unambiguous." The color drained from Mark's face. He looked from Alicia to me, his eyes wide with a kind of terrified fury. He hadn't known the ledgers existed. He had built his entire case on the assumption that it was his word against mine, a grieving, isolated woman. He hadn't counted on the ghost of our meticulous father rising from the attic to bear witness for me. Leo, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Dad, is that true?" "Stay out of this, Leo," Mark hissed, not taking his eyes off me. "But the $25,000, you told me. You said they helped with a down payment, but that this land was always supposed to be. Leo's words trailed off as the full, ugly weight of his father's deception settled on him. He had been a pawn, and he was only now realizing the depth of the game. The mediation devolved from there. Mark, his back against the wall, became belligerent and accusatory. He called me selfish, delusional, a bitter old woman clinging to a corpse. He spat venomous words about Ben, about my childlessness, about my wasted life. Mr. Sterling tried to rein him in, but the performance was over. The desperate, cornered animal Alicia had warned me about was on full display. Through it all, I sat perfectly still. I didn't cry. I didn't shout back. I just watched him. I watched the man who was my brother unravel, revealing the rotten core of greed and resentment that had always been there. And with every vile word he spat, I felt my own resolve harden into something unbreakable. Any lingering sadness, any shred of familial pity, was incinerated in the furnace of his rage. The mediator, seeing the futility, finally called a halt. "It's clear the parties are too far apart for a mediated solution today," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We will proceed to the court's trial calendar." As we stood to leave, Mark pointed a shaking finger at me. "You'll regret this, Ruth. I will bury you in legal fees. I will drag this out until you have nothing left." Alicia simply gathered her papers. "Threatening a party is not a good look, Mark. I'll be sure to note it in our filings. Good day." She guided me from the room, her hand a firm, steadying presence on my elbow. We didn't speak until we were out in the bright, shocking normality of the lobby. I let out a long, shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My knees felt weak. "Are you all right?" Alicia asked, her professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. I looked at her, and to my surprise I found a smile touching my lips. It wasn't a happy smile, but a grim, triumphant one. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it. "I saw him. I really saw him. And he has nothing." "Exactly," Alicia said, her own smile sharp and satisfied. "He showed the mediator and his own son exactly who he is. That wasn't a loss, Ruth. That was a strategic victory. He played his hand, and it was empty." Grace was waiting in the car, her face etched with worry. When I slid into the passenger seat, she searched my face. "How was it, honey? Was it awful?" I thought of Mark's contorted face, his cruel words, Leo's dawning horror. It was illuminating. I said, buckling my seatbelt, "It was the best thing that could have happened." I looked out the window as we drove away from the courthouse, back toward the country, back toward home. The confrontation had been ugly, but it had accomplished one vital thing. It had burned away the last of my uncertainty. There was no going back. There was no family to salvage. There was only the truth, and the fight to defend it. The performance was over. Now, it was time for the real trial. The failed mediation created a strange, suspended silence. The legal machinery was still grinding forward. Alicia filed motions, received discovery documents, and prepared our trial brief, but the frantic, personal energy of the conflict had dissipated. Mark's outburst had been the last, violent eruption of a dying volcano. Now, there was only the quiet, patient work of preparing for the final judgment. With Leo gone and the direct line of attack severed, my life settled into a new, purposeful rhythm. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months began to recede, not because the threat was gone, but because I had metabolized it. The fear had been transformed into fuel. My journal entries reflected this shift. They became less about documenting attacks and more about chronicling a restoration. November 30th. Legal. Alicia is drafting the pre-trial motion. She is using the mediation transcript to highlight Mark's lack of credibility and threatening behavior. Personal. Started knitting a blanket. The rhythmic click of the needles is a meditation. I am making something, not just defending something. The land itself seemed to respond to the newfound peace. Winter settled in, a deep, serious cold that silenced the world under a blanket of snow. The first snowfall was a transformative event. I woke to a world rendered in monochrome, the familiar contours of the meadow and fences softened, the chaos of the world hushed. It was a clean slate. I took long walks in the snow, my boots crunching in the profound quiet. The air was so cold it felt sharp and pure in my lungs. I'd walk to the creek, now edged with delicate laceworks of ice, and stand listening to the water murmuring secrets beneath its frozen shell. This was my cathedral. This was where I felt closest to Ben, to my parents, to the enduring spirit of this place. They weren't ghosts haunting me. They were a chorus of support, their love as solid and real as the frozen ground beneath my feet. One afternoon, I was in the barn, organizing tools that Leo had left in disarray, when I found it. Tucked behind a stack of old paint cans was a small, zippered portfolio I didn't recognize. My first paranoid thought was that it was something he'd left behind as a trap. I picked it up with a sense of dread. I took it into the kitchen and laid it on the table. With hesitant fingers I unzipped it. Inside were not legal documents, but architectural sketches. Dozens of them. Renderings of my land, my home, but grotesquely transformed. My house was labeled clubhouse or model home. The meadow was carved into neat, identical lots, each with a generic, sprawling house. There were plans for Sycamore Ridge Estates, with cul-de-sacs and streetlights cutting through the pasture where Ben and I had picnicked. This was their vision. This was the potential Leo had spoken of with such fervor. Seeing it laid out so coldly, so technically, was a visceral shock. It wasn't just an idea. It was a blueprint for annihilation. They hadn't just wanted a share of the land. They had wanted to erase it, to overwrite our history with their soulless, profitable grid. I felt sick. But the sickness was quickly followed by a fresh wave of determination. I didn't throw the portfolio away. I added it to the firebox with the ledgers. It was no longer just a record of their greed. It was a relic of their blindness. They saw a development. I saw a life, and I would make sure the court understood the difference. I showed the sketches to Alicia during our next call. She was quiet for a moment. "It's chilling," she said finally, "but it's also useful. It demonstrates their true intent far more clearly than any legal filing. It shows a callous disregard for the property's significance to you. We'll use it." As the trial date drew nearer, my preparation became more internal. Alicia had prepped me for my testimony, for the tough questions, for the character assassination Mark's lawyer would undoubtedly attempt. But I knew the most important preparation was happening here, on the land. I needed to be so rooted in my truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could shake me. I started spending time with the old oak tree Ben and I had planted, its bare branches sketching intricate patterns against the gray winter sky. I placed my hand on its rough, frozen bark. "We're almost there," I'd whisper to it, to Ben, to myself. "We're almost there." Grace and Clara were my steadfast support system. They didn't smother me with constant questions about the case. Instead, they provided a fortress of normalcy. Grace would come over with soup, and we'd eat by the fire, talking about everything but the lawsuit. Clara would arrive, inspect my woodpile, make a comment about the state of my gutters, and then sit with me in a comfortable silence that was more reassuring than any pep talk. One evening, about a week before the trial was set to begin, we were all three sitting in my living room. The fire was roaring, and a storm was whipping snow against the windows. "You're ready, you know," Clara stated, not looking up from the sock she was darning. "Am I?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. I wasn't asking about the legalities, I was asking about my soul. Grace nodded, her kind eyes full of certainty. "You've already won the hard part, Ruth. You won it when you threw Leo out. You won it when you stopped being afraid of them. The trial. That's just the paperwork." Clara grunted in agreement. "She's right. The battle was for this house. For your peace of mind. You fought that battle here. And you won. The courtroom is just where they make it official." Their words sank deep, finding a home in my heart. They were right. The real transformation had already happened. The woman who had welcomed Leo with open arms was gone. The woman who had trembled at a legal document was gone. In her place was someone who had looked into the abyss of her own family's betrayal and had not fallen in. The night before the trial, I didn't pore over my testimony. I didn't fret or pace. I took a long, hot bath. I made myself a simple meal, and then I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I sat at the old piano in the corner of the living room, a relic from my mother that I rarely played. I opened the lid and brushed the dust from the keys. My fingers were stiff and clumsy, but I found the notes to a simple, old hymn my mother used to love. The sound was faint and slightly out of tune, but it filled the house with a fragile, beautiful music. It was a sound of peace, of memory, of a life lived fully within these walls. I was not going to court as a victim pleading for mercy. I was going as a landowner, a truth-teller, a woman defending the legacy of her love. The storm was coming, but I was no longer a sapling that could be broken by the wind. I was the oak, ancient and deep-rooted. I went to my journal for what I knew would be the last entry before the final act. December 14th. Legal, trial begins tomorrow. Personal, the snow is falling. The house is warm. I played the piano tonight. I am ready. I am not going to court to find my strength. I am taking it with me. The courthouse was everything I had feared and nothing like I had imagined. It was both grand and shabby, a temple of justice with scuff marks on its marble floors and the faint smell of industrial cleaner in the air. The hallway outside the courtroom was a chaotic, murmuring river of anxious people, lawyers in sharp suits, families huddled together, individuals staring blankly at the wall. It was a place where lives were taken apart and put back together, and the air was thick with the gravity of it all. Alicia met us, a calm island in the storm. She was accompanied by a young associate carrying a heavy box of files, our arsenal. Grace and Clara flanked me, my personal guard of honor. Clara, in a severe, dark suit she must have borrowed for the occasion, looked like she could stare down a judge herself. Grace, clutching her purse with white-knuckled intensity, kept patting my arm, a silent, rhythmic reassurance. "Remember," Alicia said, her voice low and focused just for me. "You are the credible one. You are the one with the documents, the history, the truth. Answer the questions directly. Look at the jury when you speak. And no matter what he says," she nodded toward the door where Mark and his lawyer would enter. "Do not react. Your calm is your power." We filed into the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd pictured, all dark wood and green leather, with a hushed, solemn atmosphere that demanded silence. The jury was seated to the side, a panel of ordinary people, a retired-looking man, a young woman, a middle-aged mother who held my future in their hands. I tried to see them as individuals, not as a monolith. I tried to project my truth toward them. Then Mark and Leo entered with Mr. Sterling. Mark looked pale and pinched, his expensive suit seeming to hang on him. He avoided looking anywhere near our table. Leo looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, his shoulders hunched, his face a mask of miserable resignation. The judge entered, a no-nonsense woman, with sharp eyes and a voice that cut through the room without needing to be raised. The proceedings began. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my chest, but I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, my back straight, my face a calm mask, just as Alicia had instructed. Mr. Sterling went first. His opening statement was a master class in manipulation. He painted a picture of a close-knit family, of a loving brother and nephew concerned for their isolated, aging relative. He spoke of shared dreams and parental intentions, carefully avoiding any specific promises. He portrayed me as a woman frozen in grief, unable to move forward, my refusal to share the land as a symptom of my irrational attachment to the past. He was smooth, persuasive, and he made our family sound like something out of a sentimental novel. I felt a hot flush of anger, but I kept my expression neutral. Theater, I reminded myself. It's all theater. Then it was Alicia's turn. She stood, elegant and composed. Your Honor, members of the jury, she began, her voice clear and confident, filling the room without effort. This case is not about a shared dream. It is about a lie. It is about a brother, facing financial ruin, who decided that his sister's home was his to take. She laid out the facts, clean and simple. The purchase with Ben, my parents' wills, my life of stewardship on the land, and then she introduced the linchpin. And we will show you, through the defendant's own father's meticulous records, that there was no understanding. There was a clear, fair, and documented division of assets. Mark Thompson took his inheritance in cash. Ruth Thompson built hers into a life. I saw several jurors sit up a little straighter. The story was shifting. The first witness for the plaintiff was Mark himself. Under Mr. Sterling's gentle questioning, he was the picture of wounded fraternal devotion. He talked about our childhood, about how our parents loved the land, about how he'd always assumed, he'd always felt. It was a part of him, too. He was vague, leaning on emotion and implication. He was careful, rehearsed. Then, Alicia stood for cross-examination. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mr. Thompson, she began, her tone polite but edged with steel. You claim there was a family understanding that you were a part owner of this land. Can you point to a single sentence in your parents' wills that states this? Mark shifted in his chair. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was understood. Understood by whom? By you? By everyone, he said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. Did you ever discuss this understanding with your sister Ruth before filing this lawsuit? Well, not in so many words. Not in any words, correct? Alicia pressed. I tried to talk to her about the future of the property. You tried to get her to sell it to a developer, didn't you? Alicia's voice was like a whip crack. Mr. Sterling objected. Argumentative, sustained, the judge said. Alicia changed tack. Let's talk about your own inheritance, Mr. Thompson. Did your parents give you $25,000 shortly after Ruth was given the land? Mark looked like a deer in headlights. He hadn't expected this so soon. That was a loan. To help me get started. A loan? Alicia feigned surprise. She walked to our table and picked up a photocopy of the ledger page. I have here an entry from your father's personal ledger from that year. It says, and I quote, provided Mark with $25,000 inheritance advance for down payment on city property. It says inheritance advance, not loan. Can you explain the discrepancy? Mark's face was ashen. My father must have misspoken. He was old, his records. Henry Thompson was known in this community as a man of meticulous detail, was he not? Alicia asked, her voice dripping with polite skepticism. His business records were legendary for their accuracy. I suppose. So, you are asking this jury to believe that your father, a man known for his precision, made a crucial error in describing a $25,000 transaction to his son, while simultaneously maintaining a vague, unspoken understanding about a piece of land he had already explicitly given to your sister? Mark was floundering. It was a different thing. The land was different. Because the land is what you need now, isn't it, Mr. Thompson? Alicia's voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. Because your real estate ventures have failed, you are deeply in debt. This lawsuit, this family understanding, it's your last chance to get your hands on a valuable liquid asset, isn't it, Mr. Sterling was on his feet, objecting loudly. The judge sustained it, instructing the jury to disregard the question, but the seed was planted. I could see it in their faces. They were looking at my brother not as a wounded family man, but as a desperate one. Mark was dismissed from the stand, his credibility in tatters. He shuffled back to his table, not looking at anyone. The next witness was Leo. Mr. Sterling tried to use him to reinforce the idea of a shared family vision, but Leo was a broken instrument. His testimony was halting, evasive. When Alicia cross-examined him, she was surprisingly gentle. "Leo, you lived with your aunt for several weeks, is that correct?" "Yes," he mumbled. "During that time, did you ever see any documents, any letters, any notes that suggested your grandfather intended for your father to own a part of that land?" "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "Did your aunt ever say anything to suggest she believed your father had any ownership interest?" "No. In fact, you presented her with a co-ownership agreement yourself, didn't you? An agreement that would have given you half of her property." Leo looked down at his hands, his shame a palpable thing in the room. "Yes. Why did you do that, Leo?" There was a long pause. The whole courtroom seemed to lean in. Leo finally looked up, and his gaze met mine for a fleeting second. I saw not malice, but a profound, weary regret. "My father told me it was the only way to protect the family's assets," he whispered. "He told me she wouldn't listen to reason. It was the final devastating blow to their case. The reasonable nephew was admitting under oath that their plan was one of coercion, not collaboration." When the court adjourned for the day, I felt drained, as if every emotion had been scooped out of me. We walked out into the fading afternoon light. The plaintiff's side had left quickly, without a backward glance. "You were magnificent," Grace breathed, her arm linked tightly with mine. "He's lying and they know it," Clara said with grim satisfaction. "You can see it on the jury's faces, they see right through him." Alicia nodded, a tired but triumphant look in her eyes. "We've dismantled their case. They have nothing left. Tomorrow, we build ours. Tomorrow, Ruth, it's your turn. You'll get to tell your story." I looked back at the courthouse, a stark silhouette against the winter sky. The first day was over, they had thrown their best punches, and we were still standing. More than standing, we were winning. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady flame of anticipation. Tomorrow, I would finally speak, and I had never been more ready to be heard. The silence in the courtroom the next morning was of a different quality. It was no longer the hushed anticipation of a beginning, but the focused, weighted quiet of a conclusion drawing near. The air itself felt charged, as if the truth, now partially exposed, was demanding its full reckoning. I sat beside Alicia, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The frantic heartbeat of the previous day had settled into a strong, steady rhythm. Today, I would not be a spectator. Today, I would be a witness. Alicia stood to call her first witness. The defense calls Ruth Thompson. All eyes turned to me as I rose and walked the short distance to the witness stand. The wood of the chair was smooth and cool beneath me. I placed my hand on the Bible, recited the oath, and looked out at the room. I saw Grace and Clara, their faces filled with fierce encouragement. I saw the jury, their expressions open, waiting. And I saw Mark, slumped at his table, and Leo, staring at his hands. "Ruth," Alicia began, her voice gentle, leading me into the story. "Can you tell us about the land at 1873 Sycamore Ridge Road?" And so, I began. I didn't just list facts. I painted a picture with my words. I spoke of the first time Ben and I saw it, the way the evening light had turned the overgrown grass to gold. I described the sound of the creek in the spring, the taste of the first tomatoes from our garden, the bone-deep satisfaction of a day spent working together under a wide, open sky. I talked about the blisters and the laughter, about the hopes and dreams we poured into every nail we hammered, every seed we planted. My voice was clear and steady, filled with the warmth of those memories. I was not a bitter woman clinging to the past. I was a woman sharing the story of a great love, a love that was intrinsically woven into the soil of that land. I spoke of my parents, of their pride in what we had built, of their clear and loving intention in leaving the land to me. They knew it was my life, I said, my gaze sweeping over the jury. They knew it was the physical heart of my marriage. My brother had chosen a different path, a city life, and they supported him in that, too, in their own way. Then Alicia guided me to the difficult parts, the loss of Ben, the profound, suffocating grief. I thought about leaving, I admitted, and I saw a few jurors nod in understanding. The silence was unbearable. But I realized that leaving would be like losing him a second time. The land, it held me. It comforted me. It was the one thing that still made sense. Alicia then presented the key evidence. She had me identify my father's ledgers, confirm his handwriting. She projected the two crucial entries onto a screen for the jury to see. The stark, black and white clarity of my father's words. Finalized land transfer to Ruth and Ben. Consideration, love and affection. And provided mark with $25,000 inheritance advance hung in the air, undeniable and powerful. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling said, rising weakly. This is prejudicial. These are private documents. The plaintiff opened the door to the family's financial history, Your Honor. Alicia countered smoothly. We are merely providing the full and accurate picture. The judge nodded. Overruled. The witness may continue. There was nothing more for me to say. The ledgers had spoken for me, with a finality that no emotional testimony could ever achieve. Then, it was Mr. Sterling's turn for cross-examination. He approached me, his demeanor, attempting to be dismissive, trying to rattle me. Mrs. Thompson, isn't it true that you are, in fact, overly attached to this property? That your grief has clouded your judgment, making you unable to see its true potential? I met his gaze, my own calm and unwavering. I see its true potential every day, Mr. Sterling. I see it in the sunrise over the meadow. I see it in the strength of the trees my husband and I planted. Its potential is to be a home, a sanctuary, not a commodity. He tried another tack. Your brother has testified to a long-standing family understanding. Are you calling him a liar? I paused, choosing my words with care. I looked not at the lawyer, but at the jury. I am saying that memory can be a tricky thing, especially when viewed through the lens of want. My father believed in writing things down. He believed in clarity. I am trusting his words from that time, not my brother's memory of it now. Flustered, Mr. Sterling made his final, desperate move. And is it not true, Mrs. Thompson, that you are a lonely, childless woman, and that this lawsuit is really about punishing your brother for having a family, for having a son to carry on his legacy? A gasp went through the courtroom. It was a vile, low blow. I saw Grace clutch Clara's arm. I saw Alicia tense, ready to object. But I held up my hand slightly, a silent signal to wait. I looked directly at Mr. Sterling, and I felt a profound, almost spiritual, pity for him. This was the depth they had sunk to. I have known great love in my life, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent room. A love that built a home and a life out of a patch of dirt. A legacy is not just a name on a piece of paper or a bloodline. A legacy is the love you leave behind in the world. The trees I tended will provide shade long after I'm gone. The land I cared for will nurture life for generations. The love I shared with my husband is in every board of that house. That is my legacy. It is not something I need to take from anyone. It is something I was given, and have spent my life honoring. And no lawsuit, no cruel words can ever change that. The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Sterling, defeated, muttered, "No further questions." I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs steady. I had not been broken. Alicia had one more piece of theater. She called a final witness, a certified forensic document examiner. He testified that the so-called family agreement letter Mark had produced, a shaky, typed document he claimed was from our father, was a forgery. The font was from a printer that didn't exist when our father was alive. The paper contained chemical agents not used in its manufacture until years after his death. It was the final, crushing blow. Not only was their case built on a lie, it was built on a clumsy, fraudulent one. Closing arguments were a formality. Mr. Sterling's were weak, a rehash of the sentimental family narrative that now sounded hollow and false. Alicia's were a masterful summation. She walked the jury through the facts, the forged document, the financial motive, the clear evidence of the ledgers. But she ended where I had begun. "This case is not about property law," she said, standing before the jury. "It is about the sanctity of a home. It is about the memory of a great love. It is about a woman's right to live in peace on the land that holds her history and her heart. Ruth Thompson isn't asking for anything from her brother. She is only asking that he stop trying to take from her. She is asking you to protect what is rightfully, legally, and morally hers." The jury was sent to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. We retreated to a small, stuffy conference room. Grace prayed quietly. Clara sat, stoic and unmoving, her faith not in a higher power, but in the undeniable rightness of our cause. Alicia reviewed her notes, confident. It took the jury less than 2 hours. When we filed back into the courtroom, the air was electric. The jury foreman, the retired man, held a piece of paper. My heart was in my throat. "Madam Foreman," the judge said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor. On the claim of constructive trust and for partition of the property located at 1873 Sycamore Ridge Road, how do you find?" The foreman looked directly at me, and I saw a flicker of kindness in his eyes. "We find in favor of the defendant, Ruth Thompson." The gavel fell. The sound was clean, sharp, and final. It was over. We had won. There was a flurry of movement. Grace was crying, hugging me. Clara was gripping my shoulder, her knuckles white, a rare, brilliant smile on her face. Alicia was beaming, shaking hands with her associate. Across the room, Mark looked shattered, utterly broken. Leo had his head in his hands. Mr. Sterling was already packing his briefcase, his face a mask of professional disappointment. But I didn't feel triumph as I looked at them. I felt a deep, weary sadness for the family that was now irrevocably shattered, and then a profound, soaring relief. The weight was gone, the threat was over. We walked out of the courthouse into the cold, bright afternoon. The winter sun felt like a blessing. I looked up at the sky, took a deep, clean breath of free air, and knew with every fiber of my being that I was going home. Not just to a house, but to a peace that had been earned, and a future that was once again completely and unquestionably my own. The gavel's sound echoed long after we left the courthouse, not as a noise, but as a feeling, a seismic shift in the bedrock of my life. The victory, so hard won, felt strangely quiet inside me. There was no shouting, no grand celebration. As Grace drove us home, the three of us were wrapped in a shared, contemplative silence, each processing the finality of it in our own way. Clara stared out the window, a satisfied set to her jaw. Grace occasionally reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. I just watched the frozen countryside roll by, feeling the tangled knots of fear and defiance in my soul slowly, gently, beginning to unravel. When we turned onto my gravel driveway, it was like crossing a sacred threshold. The house stood waiting, its white clapboards glowing in the low winter sun, the old oak trees casting long, protective shadows across the snow-covered meadow. It was the same sight I had seen 1,000 times, but today, it was different. It was unburdened. It was free. The first thing I did was walk inside, alone. I stood in the center of the living room, and just listened. The tick of the grandfather clock, the creak of a floorboard settling, the whisper of the wind outside. These were the sounds of my life, my peace. They were no longer under threat. I ran my hand over the back of Ben's armchair, the fabric worn soft from years of use. "It's over," I whispered to the empty room, to his memory. "We're safe." The days and weeks that followed were a season of deep, quiet mending. The lawsuit had been a storm that scoured the landscape of my life, and now, in its aftermath, I was tasked with replanting. But the soil, I discovered, was richer for the trial. The fight had forced me to dig down to my deepest roots, and I had found them to be stronger than I ever knew. Alicia called a week after the verdict. Her voice was bright. "I have some final news, Ruth. The judge, in light of the forged document and the demonstrably frivolous nature of their case, has awarded you full attorney's fees and sanctioned Mark and his lawyer. They not only lost, they're being punished for the way they pursued it." It was a karmic twist that brought me no joy, only a sense of grim closure. The system had worked. The manipulators had been held accountable. The news of the sanctions spread through our small town, a quiet, public shaming that meant Mark would never show his face here again. Leo, I heard, through the gossiping grapevine that was Grace's church group, had moved to another state, severing ties with his father. The betrayers had been exposed and punished, their family unit, built on a foundation of greed, shattered. I felt a pang of sorrow for my nephew, a boy who had been led astray, but I knew his path to redemption was his own to walk now. My path was here. With the legal threat gone and the financial burden of the fight lifted, I could finally pour my energy not into defense, but into creation. I spent the rest of the winter planning. I pored over seed catalogs, not just for the vegetable garden, but for a new flower bed I wanted to plant near the porch, a riot of color where once there had only been the shadow of anxiety. I decided, finally, to convert the spare room, the room that had been Leo's, into a proper library and sewing room, a space dedicated entirely to my own comforts and hobbies. When the first, tentative thaw of early spring arrived, turning the snow to a patchwork of white and rich, dark earth, I felt a corresponding thaw in my own spirit. I was in the barn, sorting through my seed packets, when I came across the zippered portfolio of architectural sketches Leo had left behind. I hadn't looked at it since the day I found it. I carried it outside, to the fire pit bin I had built years ago. I crumpled the pages, one by one, and placed them in the stone ring. I lit a match and dropped it onto the paper. The flames caught quickly, hungry and bright, consuming the blueprints for Sycamore Ridge Estates, turning the cold, impersonal grids into ash and smoke. I watched them burn, feeling no anger, only a final, symbolic release. They had tried to impose their future on my land, and they had failed. Their vision turned to smoke, while mine was preparing to bloom. As the fire died down, I knelt and scooped up a handful of the warm ash and the cold, wet soil beneath it. I mixed them together in my palm. This was the lesson. The pain, the betrayal, the fight, it was all ash now. But it could be mixed back into the soil. It could become part of the foundation, making it richer, more fertile for what was to be planted next. The past couldn't hurt me anymore. It could only nourish me. One evening in late spring, with the peepers singing their frantic chorus in the creek and the scent of lilac heavy on the air, the aunties came over. We sat on the porch swing and the rocking chairs, glasses of iced tea in our hands, watching the light fade. The conversation was easy, meandering. We had not had an evening like this, so utterly devoid of underlying tension, in over a year. After a comfortable silence, Clara spoke, her gaze on the darkening silhouette of the barn. "You know, Ruth, when all this started, I told Grace you were dormant, a bulb in the frozen ground." She turned her sharp eyes to me. "I was wrong. You weren't dormant, you were a seed." I looked at her, curious. Grace leaned forward, understanding dawning on her face. "A seed," she echoed softly. "A seed looks like a hard, lifeless little thing," Clara continued. "But inside, it's all potential. It contains everything it needs to become what it's meant to be. But it can't sprout until it's buried, until the soil presses in on it from all sides, until it's sitting in the dark, unsure if it will ever see the sunday." She took a sip of her tea. "Mark and Leo, that lawsuit, it was the dark soil. It buried you, it pressed in on you. And my God, Ruth, you sprouted. You fought your way up through that darkness and you broke into the sun, stronger and more beautiful for the struggle." Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness but of profound recognition. She was right. The battle hadn't broken me, it had activated me. It had forced me to grow in ways I never would have in an untroubled life. So, if you're listening to this, if you've stayed with me through this long story of love and loss and betrayal and victory, this is what I want to leave you with. This is the lesson the soil taught me. Your home isn't just the walls around you or the roof over your head. It's the place where your spirit feels safe enough to grow. It's your sanctuary. And there will always be people sometimes, the people you least expect, the ones who should protect you, who will see that sanctuary not for the peace it holds, but for the price it can fetch. They will come with smiles and offers of help, with legal documents and whispered fears, trying to convince you that your fortress is actually a prison, that your legacy is a burden. Don't you believe them? Your peace is not naivete. Your love for a place is not sentimentality. It is your anchor. It is your truth. Trust the feeling in your gut when something doesn't feel right. That unease is your spirit recognizing a threat long before your mind can put a name to it. You are stronger than you know. You have a fight inside you that you may never have had to call upon, but it's there, waiting in the quiet corners of your heart. It is the sum of all your past struggles, all your survived sorrows. When the time comes to fight for what is yours, whether it's a piece of land, your peace of mind, or the very core of who you are, that strength will rise up to meet the challenge. It may be messy, it will be hard. You will be afraid. But you must plant your feet, look the storm in the eye, and say, "This is mine." You cannot have it. Because in the end, the things that are truly ours, the love, the memories, the land that holds our story, are worth any fight. And when the battle is over, and the quiet returns, you will find that you have not only protected what was yours, you have discovered a power within yourself that can never, ever be taken away. I am Ruth. I am 53 years old. I loved a man named Ben, and together we planted a life. I faced a storm that sought to tear it all down, and I stood my ground. The court protected me, yes. But first, I had to learn to protect myself. And that, my dear, is the greatest inheritance of all. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.